Welcome. Today we are grateful for a Monte Vista Grove Homes convocation offered by Reverend Frank Clark Spencer. Frank is president of the Board of Pensions, Presbyterian Church USA. Before we begin with Frank, I want to ask Lynn Cheney to lead us in prayer and read scripture.
Let's start with scripture reading. While the scriptural references to care for the aging is somewhat scarce, the writer of the letters to Timothy gives a bit of guidance on the church's responsibility to its older saints. Hear the word of God from 1 Timothy chapter 5. Do not speak harshly to an older man, but speak to him as a father, to younger men as brothers, to older women as mothers, to younger women as sisters, with absolute purity. Honor widows who are really widows. If a widow has children or grandchildren, the children or grandchildren should first learn their religious duty to their own family and make some repayment to their parents, for this is pleasing in God's sight. The real widow, left alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give these commands as well, so that they may be above reproach. And whoever does not provide for relatives, and especially for family members, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain, and the laborer deserves to be paid." And a final verse, while not directly speaking to the church's responsibility toward its seniors, surely it is good advice no matter one's age. No longer drink only water, but take a little wine for the sake of your stomach and your frequent ailments. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please pray with me. God of all compassion, we gather grateful for our Presbyterian heritage, for the wisdom and care that some 3 centuries ago established the means by which your Presbyterian servants would be cared for in their retirement years. We are grateful too for Monte Vista Grove, that for nearly a century has provided home for your retired Presbyterian clergy and missionaries. In these days of seismic change and challenges in your church, we ask your wisdom and blessing on Reverend Spencer and all who serve you at the Board of Pensions. We thank you for their leadership, for their commitment to the good, for their loving care of those who serve your church. We pray in Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Lynn. You folks have already received Frank's impressive bio. So in preparing this introduction, I garnered the following from John Rogers, Frank's boyhood pastor in Davidson, North Carolina, and from Richard DuBose, president of the Montreat Conference Center, where Frank once served as chair of that board. Listen to Frank's admiring colleagues. Frank is one whom others trust almost instinctively, with important responsibilities, with duties that must be carried out faithfully, pragmatically, and to a high standard of excellence. Frank's voice in our church is forthright in describing many of our challenges, and yet one can hear the promise and the resolve of the gospel when he speaks. It is such a hopeful voice. We are lucky to have him leading the Board of Pensions and serving as such an effective witness for our denomination, for the Reformed tradition, and for the Church of Jesus Christ. President Spencer, welcome to Monte Vista Grove Homes.
Thank you, Dean. That was certainly more than I deserved, but I won't contradict it. Let me begin by sharing my screen. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you this evening, and Dean has asked me to take a bit of an overview of where we are as a denomination from the unique perspective that this chair gives me at the Board of Pensions. We get to see a bit of the big picture that sometimes can be very hard to see from the pew or even the local pulpit. I start always with this screen because this is a stained glass window that was commissioned as a part of our 300th anniversary. And if you look at this closely, you will see that it is indeed the logo of the Presbyterian Church USA. And yet it has been deconstructed and reimagined. You can see the dove, you can see the fish, the flames of Pentecost. You can see the scripture on which everything is based, and the cross, which gives us our hope for the future and our comfort in the present. And so we use this as a symbol to say we are still grounded in all of the things that have made the Reformed tradition and the Presbyterian Church USA unique in this place, in this country, in our collective history. But we are not resting there, and we are ever looking to the future to see how we can imagine where God may be leading us. This is in the lobby of our offices at 2000 Market Street in Philadelphia. And so would welcome any visitors who get our way to drop by and see us and see it in person. What we are going to examine over the next few minutes is the church and its ministers. There are other things we could focus on, but I really want to spend some time. We've had the opportunity to do some research specifically about our ministers, and there is a lot going on in our churches and in the relationship with seminary trained ordained ministers of word and sacrament. And we've now changed back to those words after a brief detour through teaching elders, but that's a different discussion. What is the current context of the PCUSA? Well, there is certainly uncertainty within the national organization. There is ongoing discussion about how we set budgeting priorities. There are questions about potential mergers of national agencies and what's known as the A Corporation. There are questions as to how General Assembly will be conducted, whether we will continue to have General Assemblies in the same way we have known them in the past. There is a lot of uncertainty, and that creates anxiety within a lot of our leadership. We do have a declining number of congregations and members, but I'm going to hold that one in abeyance simply to say that while that is a true statement, a lot of what is happening in our numbers and organization depends on the perspective with which one looks. We'll get into that in a little more depth. There is a shifting capacity of mid-councils. At one point, we had essentially an executive presbyter or leader in every single presbytery. Today, of the 170 that are currently functioning in one capacity or another, only about 100 have installed presbyters. Many operate with volunteer and or only a clerk who often is too busy to get a lot of other things done. And so the idea that the national church worked through mid-councils is definitely falling away. Still very important in many places, but definitely a shifting capacity. The number of active members is declining. We'll take a look at some of that. There is a slowing pipeline of ordination candidates. We continue to see a diminishment within the PCUSA explicitly, and that is forcing our seminaries to look much more broadly for their student base. None at this point are majority Presbyterian. All of the student bodies are ecumenical at this point. Debt levels among new ministers, and now a plug for the seminaries. This is not seminary debt, at least not if you're going to one of the 10 Presbyterian seminaries. All of them have found ways to meet the financial needs of the students. However, many students, about half, are showing up with undergraduate debt by the time they arrive at seminary. And they can't get out of that debt while being full-time students. They may have payments suspended, but we're seeing of the 50% of graduating seminarians with debt, the average debt is $25,000 per person. That can be crushing on a minister's salary. And congregants with little time or excess capacity. Some have decried the professionalization of the ministry, but the fact of the matter is that there simply aren't as many adult volunteers with hours to give as there once were in our traditional congregational structures. It changes the need and role of staff. So that's where we are today. But I will tell you, I am unashamedly hopeful and optimistic about where we may be going. And I hope you feel the same way by the time we get to the Q&A part. Let's look at churches by size. If you ask the question, how are our congregations doing? The answer may be not so well. And on my screen, can everybody see the full screen? I may need to select a different view. There we go. If you say, how are our congregations doing, what you will see is that 75% have 150 or fewer members on their rolls. And that could be seen as, you know, a real issue, and for individual congregations, it certainly is. But if you ask the question a different way, and you say, how do Presbyterians experience church? What you find is that 70% of our members are in congregations above 150. And if you look all the way to the right, you'll see that almost all of them have sufficient budget to have called and installed leadership. It starts at 84% and moves to 100. And so if you then say, well, what are those characteristics? That is a place to worship, a more or less balanced budget, and an installed minister, installed pastor, sanctuary, and a sufficient budget. How many of us experience church that way? And the answer is 84% of all Presbyterians. Now, that's not to say we want to leave the others behind, but it is to say that this is the common experience. A sanctuary, installed pastoral leadership, and corporate worship, pandemic notwithstanding. This is the predominant form. And I will tell you that is not going away. There's lots of discussion that the church is changing. The church of the future will never be like the church of the past. And I'm here to tell you that that's simply not an accurate statement. Things are going to be different. Things are indeed changing. But the predominant experience is that we have groups of Presbyterians who come together as congregations. They have sufficient dollars to call a full-time installed pastor. And we need to recognize and celebrate that success, and spend perhaps a little less time bemoaning the smaller who can't meet this same standard. When we looked at all the churches in the denomination and we reviewed all of the budgets that are self-reported to the Office of General Assembly and are able to tie those to our studies of roles and leadership. So when we do that, there are three basic groups. There are those that are fewer than 150 members and declining. And many of those are fighting demographic and geographic challenges that they eventually will not overcome. It's a reality that Americans are moving to urban centers. Populations in rural areas are declining. And it is harder and harder, particularly with a couple, when both spouses have professional careers, it is harder and harder to attract pastors to these smaller communities. But that doesn't mean every small congregation is declining. We have those that are fewer than 150 and are stable. And they've either got dollars from the past or they have found a sustainable way. If you went back and looked at that chart I put up originally, you would see that churches from 100 to 150, about 3/4 of them are able to call ministers. And so this also includes our new worshiping communities, which average about 57 adult participants and are hopefully growing. But while I am certainly a believer in the gospel and a Lord in whom all things are new, I'm also a believer in statistics and data. And what I'll tell you is that while that component is hopeful, it's not going to make a significant difference in total membership. Even if all of those people who were participating were immediately members, it would only move our numbers by about 1.5%. So where are the other places that we need to look? We have large and growing congregations. By way of example, I looked at the 5 largest churches in Charlotte Presbytery in North Carolina, where I am a member of the Presbytery. Of those 5 largest congregations, we looked at 5 years for each of them, so 25 annual periods. And in 24 of those 25 periods, those congregations grew. On average, they grew over that 5-year period 11% in membership. That was the average growth. And so what we're seeing is where there are dynamic leaders and critical mass, there are still congregations within our denomination that are active and growing. So what does that mean for the whole picture? Well, 5 years ago, we created this graph, and what this represents is the top line assumed that those growing churches would grow at 3% a year, a little optimistic. The bottom blue line assumed that those churches simply stayed at 0 net growth. And in between, in all scenarios, the declining churches, we declined at a rate of 10% a year. And what you see is that even at 0 growth among the larger churches, we basically hit a equilibrium. At this point, our actual numbers as a denomination are within 3% of the blue line. So even 5 years ago, it turned out to be a pretty good projection. And what that says to us, and the Board of Pensions does very long-term planning, is that we are not going away. We are not fundamentally going to become a denomination of tent makers. We are not going to be a denomination of commissioned lay pastors, although each of those has its specific role to play. We will be a denomination of approximately 1.2 million for a long, long time. Geographically, there are some things that are going on. This is a map of the 10 largest presbyteries in the United States, and they're listed there. Pew, the research division of Pew, defines the arc from Washington, D.C. to Dallas as the region of the country that is most supportive of religious activity and Christianity in particular. And what you see is that 7 of our 10 largest presbyteries are now in that arc. And in fact, 4 of the 10 largest are in North Carolina alone. This is a shift that is happening, and it's happening far faster than we might imagine. At Reunion in 1983, not that long ago, the United Presbyterian Church, the northern stream, if you will, at Reunion had just under 3 million members. The PCUS had just under 1 million. And so it was about 75%, 25%. Today, the footprint that makes up the former PCUS has about 46% of the entire membership of the PCUSA. And so there have been differential declines in some areas, Dallas, Atlanta, Charlotte. Churches are experiencing growth. In other parts of the country, presbyteries are down by 70, 75, even 80% membership. And so you begin to see a differential understanding of what it means to be connected if a church in Dallas has the wherewithal to send its own mission co-workers, and in some senses have them better resourced than the national church itself. It begins to raise interesting questions, and sometimes thorny ones, between a national denomination and a more congregational feel. And if you've been to general assemblies or other national committee meetings, you've probably felt some of those tensions that we're experiencing as a church. So let's take a look at our members specifically. The board has been able to trace every minister ordained in the PCUSA since 1/1/2007. That number is 3,750. What's the makeup of that group? Well, more women than men. In fact, since 2010, we've ordained more women every year than men. That is the good news. 52% of all those ordained are under age 40. More men than women. 48 over age 40, more women than men. In those same ordinations, the average age is 38.2 years. That was in 2019, most recent data we have. Now, I don't know if that strikes you as young or old, but I'll give you some comparisons. The Episcopal Church recently did an ordination survey. Their average age at ordination now is 50 years old. So we actually are very encouraged by the 38.2, and that number is slowly going down. A few years ago, it was just over 39 years old. Women, a little older than men. And I am sad to report for us as a denomination, but you are probably not surprised, there is a distinct gender disparity in what happens to those who are ordained. 79% of all men ordained since 2007 are currently in calls with benefits. Only 67% of women have the same benefits in their calls. Women are paid less than men across all variables. We have looked at age, congregation size, and actual job role. Senior, solo pastor, senior pastor, associate pastor, so on and so forth. And I regret to say that in every case, save one, women are paid less. The aggregate disparity is about 12.5%. But what you can see is that there is a clear disparity. We are ordaining more women, and yet more men are receiving calls with benefits. So who's missing from the plan? Not everyone who we have ordained is a member of the Board of Pensions. That surprises some groups. Some groups say, well, everybody's in the Board of Pensions. Well, no, that's not true. 1,017 ministers were ordained to positions and have never received any benefits from the Board of Pensions. And here you see the gender disparity even more starkly presented. 63% of those who get no benefits are female, almost 2 to 1 over their male counterparts. Why does this matter? I'm not going to read this whole slide to you, but I'll give you the crux of it. 5 years after ordination, about 22% in aggregate are gone from ministry. So a 5-year attrition rate of 22%. We did a similar study, 2007 through 2011. We came up with 26%. So statistically very, very close to each other. But getting benefits matters. When we said, let's look at it as who got benefits and who didn't, those who never received benefits from the Board of Pensions have a 10-year attrition rate 52% greater than those who receive benefits. This shows, we believe, that we as a denomination have to be much more intentional about how we provide for those And not just those who are graduating from seminary who are seeking a call, but these are from people who got ordainable calls. And I am sure there are some situations where someone said, I'll take a call, I don't need much compensation, I've got benefits elsewhere. So that may exist, and this doesn't account for individual choice. But you can't look at these numbers in aggregate and say we don't have an issue that we've got to address from an ecclesiological standpoint, not just from a Board of Pensions standpoint. So we've taken a few initiatives to try to have an impact on these issues. We launched a pilot project with Lilly Endowment dollars. They put up $1 million. We put up $4 million initially. We have since put up another $5 million. Healthy Pastors, Healthy Congregations has signed 875 covenants between sessions, pastors, and the Board of Pensions. We've delivered 6,000 learning modules on financial health and the realities of minister economics, and subsequently provided $9 million in grants, financial stabilization grants, up to $10,000 per pastor, to help them either get out of debt, pay off student loans, or begin their retirement planning process. To help small churches, Pathways to Renewal created a dues incentive. That is approximately 50% lower than the normal dues for 5 years for congregations that previously had abandoned installed ministers and who call a young minister under 40 years of age. We've subsidized 75 new calls in that program. We're providing presbyteries with organizing minister and evangelist grants. 30 new calls have been approved in that program. We've provided almost $700,000 in minister educational debt assistance, and we've just introduced a new plan as of 1/1/21 called Minister's Choice. And this is for every minister who's in a role that is not installed, who may have access to health care, because there are ways in the United States today through spouse or partner or through the exchanges to obtain health care. For 10% of effective income, they get the pension, death and disability program, access to all of our assistance and educational programs, short-term disability, and our employee assistance program. It is a fantastic package that is simply not available in the commercial world. And we've already had 227 ministers enrolled in the first 4 months. All this is in Living by the Gospel, which is a document we put out every year. It's on our website at pensions.org, and it describes all of these. It has been endorsed by the General Assembly. Every COM and CPM should be using it, and it provides a single place where you can get all of those vocational statistics every year. We are working in a way we hope preserves those basic values that I started the presentation with. Community nature, those who can pay more, percentage dues, sliding deductibles, pensions that accrue at the higher of the median, pastor median, or the median for your job designation rather than a lower pension. Call neutrality. We still maintain that. The amount that's paid for health care for ministers does not fluctuate with family structure. We provide for transitional coverage between calls. And then there are simply non-commercial provisions within all of our programs that favor the members. And that's simply the commercial that says we're not an insurance company. So results of those programs are encouraging. Over the last 4 years, since we changed the fundamental structure of the plan, we've made over 2,000 proposals. About 40% are successful. Active plan membership is up 31% since the redesign that kicked off 1/1/2017. Not much else in the church is growing, but the benefits plan is. We've achieved cost stabilization. The dues percentage for pastors' participation, the comprehensive program for ministers, has not changed in over 4 years. We've had 8 consecutive years of apportionment increases. I hope some of you have experienced some of that. The bane of many sessions' existence, vacancy dues, have been eliminated. We were able to understand that, one, it was a pain for our constituents, but that we could get by without it financially. And the board has expanded every one of our voluntary programs. Assistance, for example, has doubled. The amount of grants have doubled in the past 3 years. One of the things that we've come to understand is that we are, as the Board of Pensions, the largest collaboration of the church. Again, I won't read you the whole slide, but what I can say is that the changes we have made have resulted in 10 million of either savings or additional grants for ministry per year since the change in 2017. Reaching marginalized communities. The Board of Pensions has made a distinct commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm happy to address those in some of the questions, but we conduct business in Korean and Spanish. We don't simply translate. We have staff members who are native speakers in both languages. We've been exploring ways to engage our African American communities. We've altered policies and programming for constituencies, marriage equality grants for same-gender couples, permanent dues reduction to recognize the deep both natural and economic disasters that have occurred in Puerto Rico. We simply cut their dues in half permanently. We increased the eligibility levels of the Pathways program I told you about for traditional African American churches, because our research showed that the cutoff for them statistically, instead of being 150, was 300. And so a congregation with up to 300 members can qualify for the Pathways program. And we've had specific set-asides in Healthy Pastors, Healthy Congregations to ensure that communities of color that were previously potentially excluded were explicitly invited to be a part of that program. We have been noticed by the broader world, the National Association of Corporate Directors, an organization of 1,500 entities and over 5,000 members, gave us one of their 3 national awards for commitment to our DEI efforts. U.S. Protestantism, captured by the corporate model. I fear I'm running out of time, but one of our challenges as a denomination And this is true of all of the mainline denominations. In fact, this is the focus of my doctoral research, which I'm in the midst of right now. We believe as Americans, and by extension as American Protestant Christians, that each congregation must stand on its own budget. And that the size of congregation and total spending, it turns out, we don't explicitly say this, but this is how we behave, sets the compensation regardless of performance. In the corporate world, and there are many articles in the Harvard Business Review, for example, call this seat value, that it's not how well a corporate CEO performs. In fact, their stock may do terrible during their tenure, but they are paid based on the number of assets and the total revenue they oversee. And it turns out we do exactly the same thing in the church. And therefore, the only way to advance one's professional career is to leave and go to a larger church. And as long as we follow this model, we're not going to solve a lot of the problems that I've shared with you already. We really have a stark choice. We can continue letting larger and larger churches draw from an ever-shrinking pool of ministers, or we can develop a system of shared resources. It certainly won't erase all disparities, but it may provide a mechanism for smaller congregations and ministers who serve them to live reasonably as full-time pastors. We haven't made that choice in the past. I'm hopeful that we may be able to get there in the future. And to that end, the Board of Pensions has entered a partnership with Pittsburgh Presbytery. We are looking at a new form of shared ministry where a minister may be installed but not yoked between congregations, providing an opportunity for full-time installed ministry in lieu of tent making and not reliant on commissioned lay pastors. And as I said, while the commissioned lay pastors certainly have a particular role in smaller congregations, particularly remote ones where a shared ministry is not a viable option, what we know is that it is fundamentally an economic choice. It is not a theological or ecclesiological choice. We have demonstrated that any congregation that can afford a minister does indeed call one. And so we need to be about the business of helping our congregations be able to afford that. And so to conclude, I do believe that God's people need educated ministers. Anything less is really an acquiescence to the culture. It is saying that economics are more important and that we're not willing to try to figure out the hard issues of providing the leadership that God's people deserve. And so we must work, and this is what we think about at the board every day, to enliven the church, not to retreat to a position that ensures decline. And 7 years ago now, when I arrived at the board, asking that one question is what changed our direction. We asked ourselves not whom do we serve, but whom might we serve? And we've seen the numbers grow by over 3,000 over these last 4 years once we were able to actually construct and make the changes. that's a lot of information, but hopefully I've touched on a number of things that will create some questions. So I'm going to go back to non-sharing mode and we'll see where we are.
Hi, everybody. I just sent out the poll. Go ahead and vote in that when you get a second. And you also now have the ability to unmute yourself. So jump in with questions whenever you want. And you can also put them in the chat box as usual.
Want to call on Lynn?
First, that was extraordinarily helpful. Thank you so much, Frank, not only for today's presentation, but for your careful stewardship of the Board of Pensions in all of its complexities. It's exciting to hear of your vision. Actually, my second comment, we would love to have you visit us here at Monte Vista Grove at any time. If I've done my math correctly, your retirement is not that far off, and we invite you to consider retiring here in our little corner of paradise, and we'll happily send you more information. Third, and this is actually the question, in the death of George Floyd nearly a year ago, we formed our own diversity task force seeking to address systemic racism here at the Grove as well as in our larger church. Among other things, we are recognizing the inequalities in salaries of clergy persons of color and pastors who have served smaller congregations over their lifetimes, which greatly impacts their retirement possibilities. We know that this is on the Board of Pensions radar, but would love to hear your thoughts on how these inequities might be addressed.
So, one, I am going to admit honestly that these are very difficult questions. And part of it relates to our structure, which is that once the dues, and I'll speak specifically to pensions in this context, we'll set healthcare aside, which is its own complexity. But in pensions, once the dues come into the Board of Pensions, the dues are then not the church's money, but collectively everyone who is due a pension. And we work on a system that is a lifetime service system. This is how we are constructed. Within that pension trust, our ability to shift dollars from one group to another group that were not a part of the pension fund is extremely limited. So I'm going to admit up front, the number of levers we can pull are distinctly limited by our legal structure. That said, it is on our radar, and we have created ways of dealing with these issues. So you heard me mention the marriage equality grants. We were able to create a program in our assistance program, which is not covered by the pension trust. It operates as a separate entity, and we were able to champion and get participation from the denomination itself, and we each funded into the assistance program an amount of money that we could then pay a pension-like payment to same-gender partners whose spouses had died before the church made its change and were therefore essentially, if you will, stranded because their partner couldn't make an election because they were already deceased. And we can do that in the assistance program. And so specific to your question, we do within the assistance program have a income and housing subsidy program for members. This is the challenge with the Board of Pensions. Everything we do by our charge from the GA and our legal documents must be for the members of the board. But what we are examining is, could we, for groups that had been marginalized in the past, develop a system where we could count not for pension years of service, but if we can get them a few years of participation so that they can become members, can we count those years of service in the calculation of the income, the retirement income support, or the housing support? So it is virtually impossible to create a retroactive pension, because as the actuaries say, you can't buy risk in the past. However, we are actively right now trying to work through the math of what it would look like to change those formulas through our assistance program to be able to provide a more robust income and housing subsidy.
Thank you.
We have a member here, Hugh Christopher, who says, I was a member of Coastal Carolina when it was organized out of several small presbyteries. This merger was typical of what happened in North Carolina. These reflect your largest presbyteries. In California, I have found much smaller presbyteries. So when we talk about the largest presbyteries, is it really due to more current activity or the mergers of the late 1980s?
It is due to the number of Presbyterians in that geography. And so when we say largest presbytery or largest synod, it is merely counting the actual membership rolls.
Our CEO, Debbie, has asked, making provisions for current and future ministers is of course vital, but what provisions are being made for those who have faithfully completed their service and retired? In terms of second career ministers with less than 20 years of service, longer lifespans of retirees which exhaust their financial resources, and the earning disparity for those who have already served small and or ethnic congregations.
So there are a lot of different categories there. Those who have served small congregations as installed pastors would have accrued pensions at a minimum of the median pastor salary across the entire country. If their salary, if their income at this point falls at any point below 65% of the active median, then they would also be eligible for income subsidies. And so we have very much focused on the idea of trying to make sure we're providing those subsidies to as broad a group as possible. At the way the current program is structured, where the average pensioner retires with 31 years, you only need 20 years to get the full income subsidy. So we have taken steps in that direction. For those who were not installed and were excluded from pension, if they are already retired and out of service, they are neither, unfortunately, they are not visible to us. If they've never been a member of the board, we don't know who that person is. Only the presbytery could know who that person is. On the other hand, if someone's ever been a member of the board, then we have a record of them and can address some of those needs. I would be misleading you to say we could address all of those needs, but we certainly have programs that are open to all members.
We are seeing more second career ministers with less than 20 years. That was a follow-up to the question you were answering. From
Okay.
Debbie.
We're seeing a few, but not a lot. There are the number of ministers we are ordaining beyond age 55 is a very small percentage of all ordinations. There are certainly some, and people who are making a choice at age 58 to become ordained are making a choice, and they need to take some of those things into account. But I would, again, be disingenuous if I said you can come in the program at 58, retire at 65, and expect a full pension. It just doesn't work that way.
This is Debbie Herbert. I just will ask more directly.
Sure.
We are the ones seeing more and more second career retirees, to be more specific, and they don't have access to the assistance program because they don't have 20 years of service.
It depends on what type of assistance they need. So right now there are pro rata all the way down to 10 years. So there is some available. Less than 10 years of service, you're correct. There's no access to the income supplement.
Okay, thank you.
We have another. Currently, the Board of Pensions offers a supplement to traditional Medicare. With the growth of Medicare Advantage plans and the push from Medicare to join those plans over traditional Medicare, is the Board of Pensions looking to make any changes?
We're not looking to make changes. We are quick to say our plan may not be the best for everyone. There are certainly regional options depending on where one lives, where you may be able to get the same or better benefits through an AARP or one of the commercially offered plans. I do think there are things we offer that are different from those plans. The first is that you have an advocate. So if you are in our Medicare supplement plan and you've got a question about your drug coverage, for example, you can call us and we are your advocate. The commercial plans, you're pretty much on your own. The second thing that is different about our plan than any commercial plan you will see is that we charge the same dues. You can read premium, but we don't say that. We charge the same dues regardless of age. So when you initially opt in to our plan, there are cheaper alternatives, because if you're only 67 years old, let's say, AARP will sell you a plan, or United Health will sell you a plan, perhaps cheaper than the Board of Pensions. However, when you're 90 years old, you may be paying 3 or 4 times because they ratchet the price up with each birthday. And yet, I would say our plan is not for everybody, but it is working extremely well for the 10,000 members we have in it. And in fact, costs have been so well controlled. In December, we sent everybody a check back for their monthly dues. So it's a unique plan. It allows you to continue with your same network, with your same pharmacy plan. You don't have to make any changes. It's not a narrow network. But there are cost differentials, and each person should look and make what's the best decision for them.
Steve Gorman is asking, is consideration being given to adding silver sneaker benefit to Medicare supplemental insurance?
We get asked this all the time. The answer is no. And the reason is that it's bad stewardship. Silver Sneakers relies on the fact that over 90% of the people who are enrolled never utilize it. They charge $4 or $5 a month for every plan participant, whether they use it or not. So if you actually figure that for each person who uses it, you're paying about, the plan is paying $40 a month. It's a great marketing tool, but it is actually designed like coupons. And in my business school career, I did a lot of focus on marketing. You put out coupons and most people never use them. And you count on that. If they did, you'd get swamped. So Silver Sneakers is a come on, and they charge for everybody in your plan. And so it's just not a good stewardship of resources.
I want to thank you, Frank, we're deeply grateful to you for spending such quality time with us today. Blessings on you and your work with the Board of Pensions. Blessings on you for all that you are and do. Next week, we have a virtuoso tenor, Jonathan Mack. He has performed with the LA Opera Company. He has performed with the major opera companies of Europe. He will sing for us and be accompanied by his son, Shannon, and they will feature the music of Irving Berlin. Next week, same time. Thank you for your presence today at this wonderful gathering.